Welcome, everyone. It looks like we have a slow trickle coming in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so welcome, nerds, to our wonderful Nerd Night of the month. We are now in April of 2021. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So first, if my computer would work, I want to introduce myself and our fellow co-bosses. If you all don't know me, my name is Helen. I am one of your co-bosses, and I will be hosting this month's Nerd Night. Our wonderful boss, Tony, did last month for the Bishop Museum takeover. And then Marissa is also here, kind of being our technological guru and kind of managing over us like an omnipotent person, just guarding the room. So before we kind of jump into things, if you guys don't already know, we kind of have a couple of ground rules. First, all of the questions have to be at the end of each talk. Please mute your mic so you don't distract the speakers while they're giving their talks. And then second, unfortunately, if you do make a ruckus, disruptive behavior will result in immediate ejection. But on the most part, everyone has been very good. No one has been belligerent except for me on certain occasions, but that's okay. We do encourage commenting in the comment box, make it a little bit more lively, but overall, we're all good. Okay. We have a good group of speakers this month. So first we're gonna have a talk by Lydia. So the order is a little bit switched. So it's gonna be the sacrifices you make to stay together even when you're a single cell. And then we're gonna move into why does the US have so many nuclear weapons? And then finally, things are related to things, intersections of hepatitis. So a good variety of things. So first, kind of jumping in like we always typically do, we're going to start with this month in science. All right, so it's going to be a kind of a little bit of a conglomeration of this month in science plus our nerd nuggets because I'm still an academic slave and therefore I had minimal time, I'm not gonna lie. But first, I want to introduce you guys to this month. There is a thing called the City Nature Challenge, and this is going to be a competition where cities from around the world compete to make the most observations of nature in one weekend. So our city is actually the whole island of Oahu, and the actual competition is going to take place from April 30th to May 3rd, so it still does count for this month in science. And then from May 4th to May 9th is going to be looking at these observations. So how it works is you're going to be using this app called iNaturalist. And so iNaturalist is a free crowdsourcing website that serves as a platform for citizen science and how they can contribute to all of these observations. It's actually it's growing and has done more than 1 million observations so far, and it's a really cool thing to kind of get everyone involved, and so you could contribute to the curiosity of the natural world from the comfort of whatever you are doing and wherever you're at. So how it works is you find something cool, you record your observation, you upload it onto the app, and then it shares with your fellow iNaturalists. And some people will kind of look through your things and you could discuss your findings. They could ID it for you if you don't know. So this is kind of a little insight of what it looks like. So you could have anything from plants, insects, animals, all of the above. They're across the world, it's more than 60 million observations strong, and it's growing. So to kind of give you a little bit of a basis, it's essentially Pokemon Go. It's Pokemon Go, but with real actual animals because things are more legit in this way. All right. So how we're going to kind of go about the competition is first, you need to find some wildlife or plants, whatever you enjoy. Look at these observations. You're going to take a picture by also noting the location because that kind of gives you a little bit of information of where it's found and helps people understand where it is. And then you're going to share these observations in the iNaturalist app, and they have it both for Android and for Apple, so whatever. And then last, you're going to identify what people have found or kind of see how people can identify your things. So across of all of Oahu, these are the amount of observations people have done so far. So it's a good factor, it's a good amount, but I personally am competitive as all hell and I like to win. And so I am encouraging everyone to join in this. And win because we're the best and we should. All right, some cool nerd nuggets. I don't have actual a nerd nuggets section this month, but cool nerd nuggets about iNaturalist in itself is that it's been used to find new populations, to look at new natives, like identify new species. It actually has been used to kind of map out new invasions and look at behaviors and interactions. So for this species of, I believe it's an orchid, this is the first ever recorded sighting of this orchid that a person kind of caught and found and put on iNaturalist. There's also been something where there was a person who had discovered this species of snail that hasn't been identified or seen in the last 100 years, but has uploaded and since been identified. And then another cool one is a 10-year-old girl in Los Angeles posted this picture of a bird that she wanted people to help identify. And it turned out the American Birding Association was tagged, and they identified it as a rare sighting of a social flycatcher, which has never actually been sighted before in the area. So these are some cool little things that people have used, and iNaturalist also has projects that you can follow. But aside of all the side projects, the more important thing is we need a win, and also it's cool. But if you have any questions or if you're interested, these are the organizers, Valentina Alvarez, and then also Dr. Robert Thompson. So you have these emails on here. If you need their information or if you have any more questions, you could also reach out to us. And that's kind of our very brief, very quick introduction for this month. So in addition to that, we are also interested in hearing from you guys about what interests you. Is it science? Is it cartoons? Is it history? Doesn't matter. If you find it interesting and want to tell it to a group of drunk people, this is the time to do it. This is your day. This is your time to shine. All right. So contact us if you want to be a speaker for 2021. And then next, mahalo to DJ Globes, who has been fire, absolute just fire for these last few, or pretty much ever, all of our Nerd Nights. And then also mahalo to all of you for joining us this evening. And with that, kind of jumping right into our first speaker, Lydia Baker will talk about the sacrifices you will make to stay together, even when you're single-celled. And then everyone, go, grab your beverage, and let's get started.
So this is the first time I've done this not in front of a group of people drunk, and it's going to make me a little sad not to be able to do that, but here we go. So I looked up, I always like looking up the title for my things and seeing what Google pops out, and apparently they really wanted me to show you all some cis het white couples kissing. So we're going to talk about the sacrifices you make to stay together, even when you're a single cell. And I feel like a lot of the ways that we approach topics in this in biology is like this story of romance and togetherness and symbiosis, specifically the kind of symbiosis that's a mutualism, where it's two things interacting together, two organisms interacting together to the mutual benefit of one another. And we really like to think about things that way. And so that's why we've described anglerfish this way. So anglerfish, what you're seeing here is a female anglerfish. She has that lovely lure at the top of her head that you can see is glowing. But this is actually the only video we have of a live anglerfish with an attached male. So males are actually 100 times smaller than their female counterparts. And for some species, they will actually attach onto the female and eventually become part of her. They will eventually like share blood even, and he will never swim again. They will just be attached forever. And this is in popular media described as anglerfish taking romantic attachment to a whole new level. And when they went and did all of the more complex work to figure out how they're able to maintain this bond is, I hate this because I can't read it. Anglerfish drop their immune defenses to find love. But the way we describe it when we talk amongst ourselves is, this is an example of a codependent, oh goodness gracious, here we go. I hate this sometimes because I'm trying to like look at y'all and do this at the same time, and then it just gets screwed up. There. This is actually an example of a codependent relationship that is slightly abusive. Actually, I go beyond being slightly abusive because in this case, it's a case of unrealistic expectations where one partner makes excessive demands of you and insists that you spend all your time together. Basically, once the male is attached, he's never becoming detached, which is not healthy. But again, I like these nested symbionts. So anglerfish actually have a symbiosis additional to their parasitic males, which is basically what lights their anglerfish lure. It's actually glowing bacteria. And so these bacteria have this, again, another symbiotic relationship. And we like to cast this as the bacteria get shelter and reliable food sources, and the anglerfish gets light, and that light helps them to do something we don't actually understand because we have so little data on anglerfish, but we can pretend. That's a talk for a different time. But the bacteria also, in the same way that the male loses a lot of its autonomy and forces the female to live with them forever, bacteria become dependent on their host and they end up losing a lot of genes as they become more and more dependent on their host. And we can see this if we look at the different kind of symbionts that there are. They eventually just lose more and more of themselves until they become these tiny facsimiles of themselves that are barely able to do anything on their own, which is actually really the case of that's what kind of a codependent relationship is. You build your personality, yourself around some other person, so much so that you kind of lose track of your identity and your autonomy. So they do this through isolating, manipulating, and controlling the other to meet their needs. And in this picture is actually one of our only videos that we have of anglerfish swimming. They're basically just gigantic goo heads. They're very singular. They don't have a lot of other, we've really never seen two anglerfish next to each other. And they're bad at swimming, so they're pretty much just reliant on the currents to push them around. So it's a very solitary lifestyle, except for the males attached to them. So anglerfish symbionts are interesting because if we track where they are in the progression of their loss of genes, they're actually kind of in the middle right here. They're kind of between recently host restricted and long-term obligate pathogens or symbionts. And this is surprising because anglerfish diversified about the same time that the dinosaurs around. So these bacteria have been associated with anglerfish for a very, very long time. And then what else complicates it, if we try to think about how those how that bacteria gets from anglerfish to anglerfish do not reproduce and produce offspring at the same depth where they're produced. They actually produce this mucosal net that floats to the surface. And they exist as these little cute jelly bean looking things because anglerfish are actually pretty small. Hold on one second, I'm gonna get my, I have a thing that I forgot to bring. This is how big an anglerfish actually is on average. He's so small and cute and tiny. And their babies are even smaller. They're about yay big. So these little jelly bean things are sitting up into the surface ocean. And at one point it gets triggered and decides that it needs to become a full-grown anglerfish. And just like a caterpillar becoming a beautiful butterfly, the jelly bean becomes this dark, ugly thing with big teeth and an lure that pops out of its head. So at what point do they get their bacteria? At what point do they acquire them, right? So that will tell us a lot about where they're, how they're progressing, how they're evolving with their hosts, how much they're losing to be part of this relationship. And the one way we can really figure this out is there's actually, anglerfish are the most speciose fish of the deep sea. So if they have lots of different bacteria, then it can tell us that they're co-evolving with their host, which means they're probably being transmitted from parent to offspring. So we had this fantastic collection of anglerfish that were collected from the Gulf of Mexico and from the North Atlantic. And we can go through and look at these trends because if we, even though we know what their genome looks like, we can be able to take this and see how they're being able to escape these relationships, or if they ever do, or if they're transmitted from parent to offspring. Oop, I thought I rearranged this. I guess I did not. So if it turned out how a lot of what we would expect from looking at their genomes, from having those tiny genomes, but not fully tiny, we would expect the kind of relationship on the left. If we compared the host and the bacteria and how they are evolving, we use these cool little trees to figure this out. We basically make these trees and try to see how closely they are related to each other. If we make these trees and those trees match, it means that the bacteria are passing from parent to offspring. If they don't match and we get this big, huge tangle, then we basically can say that they're being passed through the environment. So when we do and look at the actual data, even though we have fish from all over these different ocean basins that they can't swim, it turns out that the bacteria, the only hypothesis that works is that the bacteria are transmitted through the environment. So how are these bacteria, I didn't go into it, but their genes are actually so restricted that the only thing that they can eat is sugar. There's not a lot of sugar in the deep sea. It's a really nutrient poor place. It's cold, it's high pressure. How are these bacteria escaping this essentially restrictive codependent relationship and finding a new host? And especially there's one bacteria that's shared by lots of different hosts. Well, if we go ahead and look at them under the microscope, we see that some of them have these granules of PHB, which I don't mean PHB is not something we see in normal life. It's actually kind of a fatty body. So what these bacteria do is they save up for a rainy day. They keep all of this in them. And they also have the ability to produce a flagella. So they're able to move. Once they get out of the host, they're able to actually swim, which is a huge advantage in the deep sea. And so I think we can think about bacteria as giving us a little pointer on how to get out of these unhealthy relationships, which have an exit strategy. So, deep breath. We learned something fancy and fun from the anglerfish symbionts. Let's go ahead and take a look at coral symbionts. Now, I'm talking to people from Hawaii, so you all already know this, but I always keep this in for anybody who missed it or maybe didn't know. Coral is an animal. It looks like a very small sea anemone. And associated with coral are algae. It's actually what gives it its color. This algae is called Symbiodinium, but I'm just going to keep calling it algae throughout this talk. But what's really cool is that, again, nested symbiosis, right? Since 1970, in every histological sample of a cropora found in the Caribbean, we have seen Rickettsia-like organisms. And these Rickettsia-like organisms in normal states do nothing. They just are in a normal part of the biome. So as long as everything's fine, they're fine just coexisting. But the moment that there's stress, they take up way too much space. And they make it hard for any of the other bacteria to kind of establish. And they fill up that space. And so that when they get stressed out to the point where they leave, they're not left with the kind of bacteria that they need to defend themselves, and they're way more susceptible to disease. Again, analogies. And so we wanted to know how these bacteria are getting from coral to coral. We had all of these different sample sites, and we looked at 3 different types of coral. And I could see I'm eating into my own time, but we figured out that the bacteria is actually differentiating by location, not by host, which is surprising because Rickettsia, these specific bacteria they have this restricted genetic capacity. They're not able to make a lot of their own, in this case, amino acids, or even their own energy producing molecules. So they're completely dependent on a host. And so we'd expect them to match that host phylogeny, but instead we find that they're matching their location phylogeny, which means that they're environmentally transmitted as well. Or you can think about it as horizontal transmission, which means they could be taking a ride on multiple hosts. So this bacteria, even though it's in this relationship where it's losing a lot of its genes, it's really dependent on a host, it's able to maintain its networks and protects its boundaries. So as anyone can tell, I'm really big on analogies. This was hard for me to talk about. I had signed up to do this in February, and that was about the year marker for me leaving my own abusive relationship. I just want to say for anybody out there who this touched a nerve, it's not your fault. The way you get out of it is to disentangle and set personal boundaries, exit the relationship and circumstances, and give yourself time to heal. So please do take care of yourself, and I would love to take any questions about abusive relationships or symbionts. Thank you. Woo! Should I leave the share up?
Sweet. So I'm glad to be presenting today. This will be fun, hopefully. So I'll be talking about why the US has so many nuclear weapons. So just a little about me. I am a PhD student at Princeton University. I've been living here in Honolulu for the last year, a little bit over the last year. My grandma grew up here or was born here and retired here, and so I've always wanted to move here, and I love it. It's been great. I'm hoping to do the rest of my PhD here. So hopefully once things kind of return to normal, I'll be able to see you guys all in person. The way this is going to work is I'm going to put a lot of text on the slides and I'm going to talk. And if you want to understand everything, you might have to try to read everything quickly. And I'm going to blow through the 18 slides in hopefully 12 minutes, and then you can ask questions at the end, 12, 15, 10 minutes, whatever. So why does the US have so many nuclear weapons? This is a really complicated topic, but I think there's basically 3 central reasons with one underlying reason. And that has to do with strategy, history, and then kind of the complexity and the difficulties of today's situation. So the kind of underlying reason is that states are obsessed with national security. Nations are obsessed with national security. Why are they obsessed with national security? Well, there's been 10,000 wars roughly throughout recorded human history. Over 1 billion people have died during those wars. The US mainland has been relatively shielded from violence and conflict for a long time, but we forget just how prevalent human violence is, right, as kind of citizens. But our policymakers don't, and they understand the history, and they know that humans are violent people, violent species, and we kill each other. And so they when they get put in positions of power, they feel a sense of responsibility that as citizens we often forget about. And so they take that responsibility seriously, and they worry a lot about the risks of war. And they imagine, well, if this happens, did I do everything I could to prevent it or make sure it works out well? And what's the biggest threat to national security? The biggest threat to national security by far is nuclear weapons, hands down. And pretty much every president for the past 50 years, and most presidential candidates, and except Trump and Nixon basically, have said that non-proliferation is the biggest threat to US national security. And they really mean this. And so pretty much everything comes down to national. Victoria, can you turn that off, please? Sweet. Okay, so let's talk about nuclear strategy. What is nuclear strategy? We'll start with the physics. So the physics is that there's a ton of energy released in a nuclear reaction, right? Way more, to split the atom than to rearrange electrons. And this has 2 consequences. One is that nuclear weapons are light, and 2 are that nuclear weapons can destroy other weapons because they have just such a large destructive radius over large distance. And so this has completely revolutionized warfare because basically military victory is now impossible. You can't, you can destroy a country before you can beat its army, right? Because you just bomb the country. And so this is kind of changed the way we do warfare. And this is called the nuclear revolution. So what is the nuclear revolution? Well, this is basically it. Here's Richard, here's me, right? And Richard's on this call. And we used to be roommates. And let's imagine that me and Richard don't have nuclear weapons, right? And we're in conflict and we might go to war. But if we develop, you guys can come on the call, but if we develop nuclear weapons, then what's going to happen is that we're going to know that if me and Richard fight, it's going to end really, really badly. There's no way that we fight and it doesn't end in just violence and destruction, chaos and Armageddon. And so we decide not to fight each other. And so basically the idea is that nuclear weapons stop war between countries and kind of reduce violence and conflict. And that's the basic idea, but it turns out that this is wrong in practice. Why is this wrong in practice? There's a couple of reasons, but the main one has to do with allies, right? It has to do with what's called extending deterrence. When I try to not just prevent war between me and Richard, but prevent war between my ally and Richard. And my ally in this case is Jake, who also lived with me and Richard. And so the dynamics are a little bit complicated. So let me explain this. So Jake's my ally, right? And you know, Jake, I say, dude, if he attacks you, then I'm gonna defend you, right? That's how like alliances work. But you know, humans are selfish and nations are selfish, and so allies don't really know that you're going to come to their aid, right? If Gondor asks, Gondor calls for aid, is like Rohan going to come, right? Well, they did, but a lot of times in history they haven't, and so you have to prove to Jake, basically, or try to convince him to believe that you're going to come for his aid. And so to do this, you employ this strategy called damage limitation. And what is damage limitation? Damage limitation is basically, I try to have the ability to take out all of Richard's nuclear weapons with my nuclear weapons, right? So if I were to fire all of my weapons at Richard, I could destroy most of his weapons, or maybe all of them even. And the point is not to actually do that. The point is to prove to Jake that, hey, look, you can trust me because I got you, because Richard can't touch me. Like, I got him, right? So that's kind of nuclear strategy in a nutshell. All right, so what else? So okay, there's this historical factor which had to do with West Berlin and West Germany, and led to this arms race in the 60s, and the 50s and 60s. And so I'll try to explain this. It's kind of complicated. So basically, you had Berlin, which was in the heart of Soviet territory, separated between West Berlin and East Berlin. And the Soviets had a big military. They surrounded on all four sides. There's no way you can defend this, right? If the Soviet Union wants to take this territory, they can. And under, before nuclear weapons, they just would have, right? They would have just taken it. Why did we split it in two? We split it in two because of domestic politics. So Germany had just basically contributed to 2 world wars. 100 million people died. That's a lot of people. You kind of wanted to prevent that in the future. So the US stuck around to kind of keep the peace, look over Europe, and they split Germany in two. But the Germans had a say in all this. And they said, whoa, hold on. We want Berlin to be split in two too, because when we get unified, we want Berlin to be the capital of a unified Germany. And so this was impossible. So that was an issue. And then you also had West Germany. And basically the Germans had a say in all of this. And they said, we don't want you to take a military strategy, which would make sense, which would be falling back behind the border, absorbing nuclear attack, and then kind of defending and digging in. They said you need to defend us at the border. And the Germans had a lot of leverage because they said, well, if we don't like what you're going to do, A, we'll leave the alliance, and B, we'll acquire our own nuclear weapons. And this freaked everybody out because the Germans had just started 2 new world wars. And if the Germans had nuclear weapons, who knew it would happen? And nuclear weapons, this issue of proliferation of weapons then was seen as the biggest issue in the world in terms of national security, and today it is as well. And so, this was this like crazy, absurd situation because you had this like island in enemy territory, which you like had to convince Germany you were willing to defend. And you also had to defend at the border. You couldn't fall back at all, even though militarily that's what made sense. And then you had all this domestic politics, and you had this mistrust, and you had this, it was just like super complicated. And the only way to solve this puzzle, basically, was to say, okay, well, we can prevent the Soviets from taking over Berlin if we employ a strategy of massive nuclear retaliation. So basically, any Soviet aggression, we're firing all our nukes, and they know, and they'll know this, and so they won't do it. And the idea was to deter the Soviet Union from pursuing any aggression. And the period was like, 1958 to 1962 was this period of crises that had to do with West Berlin. So the Soviets were not pleased. They wanted the situation to change because of immigrants and because they were worried about Germans getting nuclear weapons. And this actually led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. All these things are kind of connected. So by 1963, Cuban Missile Crisis happens. Everyone realizes, holy shit, we might destroy the world. Let's kind of like take it a little bit easy. And you'll notice that the US kind of stopped producing nuclear weapons after then. I don't have proof that this is what caused it, but a lot of people kind of think that, the geopolitical issues and these kind of these complex relationships between states are really what drives the weapons more than like domestic politics or things like that. So, the US kind of slowed down after that because the threat was a lot less. They kind of figured out the situation. Okay, so so we built a bunch of nuclear weapons, then we had arms control, we like reduced our arsenal, the Soviets reduced their arsenal. Why can't we continue to do that? Why can't we like further reduce the role of nuclear weapons? Well, it has to do with, in the US, I mean, the US arsenal has to do with alliances. So Obama, in 2009, declared in a speech in Prague that he was going to try to work towards a world free of nuclear weapons. And he largely was not able to accomplish the things that he set out to do when it came to nuclear weapons, which he really genuinely wanted to do. I mean, it came from his time as an undergrad learning about nuclear weapons and thinking, oh my God, this is terrible, we need to change this. But Obama's a pragmatist. And what did Obama, realize? He realized that he had a lot of nervous allies. He had a lot of nervous allies in Asia, a lot of nervous allies in Europe, who the US extends deterrence to, who we have decided to defend. And if the US were to reduce the size or aggressiveness of its nuclear arsenal, then those countries would say, fine, we're going to get nuclear weapons. And remember, nuclear nonproliferation is the most serious national security threat to the US. Whether it's our allies or whether it's our enemies, it doesn't matter. It's the most serious issue. And everyone thinks that a world with more nuclear weapons is worse than a world with less nuclear weapons. So we'll say, okay, fine, we won't change everything. We'll take small, moderate, incremental steps. And so, if you imagine trying to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, that might be good from like, most people would agree. Politically, that's like what's popular, but it would also lead to a world with more nuclear weapons. And so you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Now, I'll use these last few slides to talk about why nuclear nonproliferation is such a kind of underrated and important topic. So why does the US have alliances? Why do we extend deterrence to all these countries, to, most of Europe, Canada, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, South America, and then partners like Taiwan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent, Israel. The main reason, I mean, there's lots of reasons, right? But from defense, from a security perspective, it comes down to the US has decided to take on this leadership role in the world to try to prevent other countries from getting nuclear weapons, because they've decided that that's what's good for the US and that's what's good for the world. Anyways, so all of these things that I talked about, strategy, history, Obama today, this is all about non-proliferation. But US foreign policy as well is also kind of largely driven by non-proliferation. And this is kind of, say, whispered, not spoken. People don't say this outright. They're not gonna tell you, oh yeah, we have an alliance with Germany because we don't want Germany to get nuclear weapons because everyone would freak out because they've started 2 world wars, right? But I mean, that's the reason, right? That's what's causing us to keep nuclear weapons and troops in Germany, and I mean, that's what's causing us to have, military bases around the world. That's probably why Hawaii is a military base. Maybe you could argue it would be a military base no matter what, but the US has 800 military bases around the world, can project power, the reason is because we want to assure our allies that that they are safe and that they don't need to get nuclear weapons. It's a very selfish move, right? And so, personally, I would love to see us spend less money on the military. I think we can do that. I think US military spending is like egregious and very much driven by domestic priorities in a lot of ways. But our overall foreign policy, it is difficult to imagine the US not playing a big role, right? Because the alternative is widespread proliferation, and this could lead to nuclear war, and that'd be really bad. Okay, so this last one's kind of speculative, and I don't have any evidence for this, but I'm going to talk about the connection between nuclear weapons and Hawaii, because why not? So what is this? So this is a B-52 bombers, which are nuclear bombers, and it's a bomber route that they took, and they would refuel at these places. And they were continuously in the air because they wanted to be able to respond really quickly to Russian, if something went badly with the Soviets, if a crisis escalated. And they went through Alaska. And this started actually in 1960. Okay. Now when did Hawaii become a state? Hawaii became a state in August 1959. Hawaii became a state after Alaska. And it really took Alaska becoming a state for the national government to be willing to say, okay, Hawaii can become a state. You know, Hawaii had 93%, 93% of the population of Hawaii wanted to become a state at the time. And so, you know, so you say, okay, well, Hawaii statehood came down to Alaskan statehood. What did Alaskan statehood come down to? And it's well understood and well accepted that, you know, geopolitical importance of Alaska in terms of its position to Russia was really important. And why was its position relative to Russia important? Well, because we wanted, you know, to use Alaska. I mean, it was a territory anyway, so it didn't need to be a state, but we recognize its importance, right? And so I would argue that it's very likely that our kind of obsession with nuclear weapons and credibility and kind of responding to Russia in Europe was the main kind of geopolitical driver of our recognition of the importance of Alaska, and why we made it a state. And again, the reason we wanted to extend our deterrence was to prevent proliferation in Europe and kind of stabilize Europe, prevent another world war. So this is all speculative. I don't know if this is true. The other stuff has more kind of you can find, there's historians have been able to go through the documents and kind of find a lot of evidence for these things, but this one is much more speculative. Anyways, so I'll take questions.
Thanks, Nick. I didn't see any questions come through.
The two things, intersections of hepatitis.
Yay, thanks so much. So hi, everyone. I'm Thaddeus, he, him, and I am going to talk to you about hepatitis today. I don't have a slide about myself, but to introduce myself really quickly, I'm part of the Hep Free Hawaii Coalition. People in the community call me the Queen of Hepatitis, but you can also call me Your Majesty. I'll respond to that just as quickly. So today we're going to talk about how things are related to things, which is a very basic concept, but it's something that we use to approach hepatitis, because the way we do hepatitis work in Hawaii is actually use hepatitis as a jumping off point to social justice. And we look at the intersectionality of hepatitis and we think about how everything is basically related to everything else. So we approach things from harm reduction. So I'm going to read this to you. Just kidding, I would never do that to you. Harm reduction is just the philosophy that we espouse. And this is really the idea that we're not here to judge people. We're here to help people in whatever way that they want to be helped, right? So even though I'm going to talk about liver health today, continue to drink your drink. Harm reduction, do what you need to do. So harm reduction is this idea, if you imagine a ladder or a stairway, right? So we're all on these stairways or ladders through our lives, and usually we're going to talk about drugs. So I know we talked about 5-stage clingers, we talked about big dick contests, and now we're going to talk about sex and drugs. So welcome to Nerd Nite, everybody. So if you're on this stairway, right, and the stairway is drugs, we're just here to see if you can take a step down the stairway. We're not saying you have to get off the stairway at all. We're just saying, hey, maybe we move you down so that if you fall off, there's less harm that comes to you, right? So this is the idea of syringe exchange. This is the idea of safe consumption spaces. This is the idea of naloxone, preventing overdoses. So this is where we're already starting to connect that hepatitis is related to substance use and to drug decriminalization and other similar topics. But what does this actually look like? So let's say you leave tonight or you take a breath outside and you see a needle on the ground. You're like, I don't want anyone to step on this needle. If you were to prick your finger with that needle, your chances of getting HIV are less than 1%. HIV hates being outside of the human body, so that's lucky for us. However, if it was hepatitis C, it'd be 10 times more infectious. And if it was Hep B, it'd be 100 times more infectious, right? So I work in HIV, I work in hepatitis, I work in harm reduction. I'm not denigrating the work we're doing in HIV, but just acknowledge that there's a lot more people affected by hepatitis, and there's a lot of work that can be done. There's a lot more people dying now of hepatitis in the US. So you can kind of see where the lines intersect. And that's where hepatitis C is taking over in terms of mortality. For all the other 60 notifiable diseases, pre-COVID. I'll just say that right now. This is just a slide so you can kind of see that, something pretty and visual. But what's happening in Hawaii? So let's keep it local. So Hawaii has the second highest rate of liver cancer in the entire country, and the leading causes Hep B and Hep C. And these are some of the communities that are affected, right? So Hep B really affects Asian Pacific Islanders. You might know one or two if you live in Hawaii. Hep C pretty much affects every single adult. And then Hep B and C also affect people who inject drugs. And this used to be this idea of someone just like sitting in an alleyway with a spoon lighting crack, right? But increasingly we know, if you're just paying attention to anything in the world, especially in the US, that the opioid epidemic is making it so that we all probably know someone who uses what are sometimes termed hardcore drugs to some extent, or have in their past, right? So just to really kind of open up, these are the people that we know and love, not to stigmatize these communities at all, but really we know these people and how can we help them? So you might be a few drinks in, but I'm gonna see if you are still able-bodied. So if you could raise your left hand, I'm gonna imagine everyone can raise their left hand, good job. Okay, how about if you raise your right hand? Good job, everyone. Very good. Okay, put it on your rib cage and say good evening to your liver. Hey, Miss Liver, what's up? That's your liver underneath there. If you feel your liver, please sign off immediately and go to Queen's ER. You should not be feeling your liver. The rib cage is protecting it. And your liver is really important, does all this stuff. I'll read all 500 vital functions to you now. Just kidding, I would never do that. But basically everything that goes to your body is processed in some way through your liver. So if your liver's fucked up, you are a little bit messed up too. And that's why we care about hepatitis, because hepatitis affects your liver, right? So this is what it looks like. Remember how gorgeous and beautiful she was before earlier, just 2 minutes ago? This is what can happen if you get hepatitis. It can lead to fibrosis, scarring, or eventually cancer, and then maybe death. And so it takes 20 or 30 years to show up. So there is time. And that's why we really kind of wanted to share this with you folks today. We're seeing liver cancer go up, unfortunately, and this again is related to substance use and other things that I'll talk about, because everything is related to everything else, right? If you don't remember anything at all, just remember that from this talk today. So you could see here that liver cancer not only rising, but rising among people of color. So when we talk about hepatitis, we're talking already about substance use, about racism, and about other issues that are broader than this single disease. So Judge Judy is one of my favorite people. I'm not going to make you rise, but let's just imagine, or you can, if you want, raise your right hand again and lower your right hand if you've ever smoked anything. Safe space, harm reduction, no judgment. Okay, I see some people lowering. Lower your hand if you've ever ridden a bike without a helmet. And then lower your hand if you've ever eaten fast food, right? So we've all done things that we know are unhealthy, but there's a benefit to it. And we just want to remember this as we talk about this section, because there's a benefit to doing drugs, right? We can judge people, we can tell them not to do it, but hey, maybe you had a hard day and you just need to kind of blow off a little steam, literally, or you had a lot of trauma in your life and this is the only way to process, or you're addicted and it's already changed your brain chemistry such that you need the drug. So acknowledging that people need drugs and use them for a benefit that might not necessarily be healthy is really important in our work, because that allows us to approach them in a humane way. So C, hepatitis C is what we're going to talk about. And C is for cooker. So imagine I were to shoot up right now. Cooker is that spoon that you see in the movie, or a tea light candle. You put your rock or your drug in it, you add water and you cook it, right? You melt it and then it dissolves. You put a cotton on top of that, you draw it up into your syringe, you hopefully tie off in a good place, you use an alcohol swab and you inject yourself. So C is for cooker because it's not just a needle that can infect you with hepatitis C, but it's all of the paraphernalia, right? So just remember that it's not just a syringe or needle. If you're going to use drugs, make sure you're using first or you're using clean works. This is just a message that we share with all of our folks when we work with them. This is just acknowledging and showing you folks real quick that the type of drug you're injecting also affects your chance for Hep C, because it affects the size of your syringe and the size of your needle. But I already mentioned that injections going up, opioid use is going up. This is the United States. The darker parts are showing about 1,000 to 5,000 prescriptions of opioids per person. You can kind of see here, I'm not going to belabor that. I'm going to actually go to what's happening in Hawaii. So Hawaii has lower rates of overdose. You can kind of see the red there, and it's going down compared to the US. Just look at the yellow line here. Overdose is the #1 leading cause of accidental death in Hawaii right now, more than car crashes, more than collisions, more than drownings, right? So even though we're lower than the rest of the US, it's still a major issue for us. These bars just show really that it crosses all genders and all age groups. We don't have people of trans experience here, so I just want to acknowledge that as well. And as we see things related to things, right, opioids going up, Hep C's going up, we're also seeing wounds go up. So MRSA is also coming back in a major way. And we're all seeing this related to hepatitis. So when we do our work in hepatitis, we're doing work around substance use, we're doing work on wounds, and we're doing work around gender equity. So we're seeing it go up among women, and especially women of childbearing age, and we're seeing it go up among youth. And this is local data from our syringe exchange, just showing that Hep C exposure has been increasing among younger people who use drugs in Hawaii who go to the syringe exchange every year. This is local data again from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, just showing that our youth in public high schools and middle schools are using prescription pills without a prescription, and they're also starting to inject more. And this data was updated last year. So really acknowledging that, again, how things are related to things, our work is looking at gender equity, youth work, and also LGBTQ health and health access. So for our LGBT local youth, lesbian, gay, bisexual, we're seeing more kids using drugs, and especially using prescription drugs without a prescription and injecting. If you identify as trans, that's even higher. So how can we support our local communities? How can we make sure that all the social justice work we're doing ties in together? So I'm actually going to turn it over now to Maya, my co-presenter, and actually a healthcare provider, to talk a little bit more about the clinical stuff, and then we'll end right there. So go ahead, Maya.
Hi guys, my name is Maya. Thank you, Your Majesty. I am a registered nurse, and I am a clinical operations manager at a local clinic here. So we actually do specialty care focusing on infectious disease. So Hep C risk for all adults who should get tested for Hep C. The bottom line is everyone should get tested at least once. If you're pregnant, you should get tested at every pregnancy. And then anyone who has any risk factors, you should get tested on a really regular basis. So, but short answer is everybody should get tested. Thanks. Okay. So Hep C, the first kind of testing that we do is antibody testing. So if you follow the tree, what you would have is you're either reactive or non-reactive for the antibody. So if you're non-reactive, that means that you didn't have any exposure. Your body wasn't creating antibodies. So no harm, no foul, move on with your life. If you are reactive, oh, you went so fast. If you are reactive, you then get tested for the Hep C RNA. So if it's not detective, you don't have a current Hep C infection, we would just recommend repeat testing, making sure that you cleared the infection. Generally, we're gonna do like ultrasounds on you to make sure that you're not carrying anything. Usually because like you're not having a viral load at all, we can't do any like additional testing on you in terms of like genotyping and figuring out like what to do. But if you are detectable, that does mean you have a current Hep C infection. So like you would either go to like the liver specialist, or you would come to a clinic like mine and be linked to care so that we could get you on treatment. So this is kind of like a repeat of the other slide. It's just a different way to look at it. So if you're exposed, you're going to develop a surface antibody, but if you're actually infected, you're going to develop a viral load. So there is no immunity to Hep C. So you do have to test again when there's a new risk. And along with that, there's no immunity even if you've been treated. So even if you've completed a course of treatment, it doesn't mean that you are like, Superman and you're good to go. So Hep C, it used to be kind of like a when were you born, because we were really focused on like baby boomers. But again, going back to that slide that I did a couple seconds ago, like realistically, everybody should be tested. So are you a person? You should be tested, period. Reducing exposure is obviously important. Your Majesty just did a beautiful presentation on harm reduction. So especially if you have those high exposure areas, just recognizing that you have them, getting the tested that you needed. If you know that you're, like I'm a nurse, and when I did ER work and I was regularly exposed to poop, really important to like have, those universal precautions, making sure that I was like gowned and gloved up, really practicing good hand hygiene. I think everybody's had a year of the pandemic, so we're all familiar with good hand hygiene and staying away from other people. But knowing that having unprotected sex can put you at risk, being exposed to blood products, being exposed to fecal material, those are all things can put you at risk. So making sure that you're tested appropriately. C is for cure. You might not need a treatment. So check with your doctor, take care of your liver, take care of your loved ones. So I don't know how you do this, Thaddeus, because Thaddeus came up with the slides because he's fabulous. But I guess I'm curious if you guys think that there is a treatment for Hep C, or if you think that there is no treatment for Hep C, or do you guys even think there's an immunization for Hep C? And I know we said we'd save this till the end, but if you guys kind of want to either turn off your mics really quick and let me know, do you guys think that there's an immunization for Hep C? Anybody?
No.
You're right. There is no immunization for Hep C. I really like that little at the end. Very, very self-assured. That was excellent. So there is no immunization for Hep C, which is why I think a lot of people, even my patients that I commonly talk to, they think that they just got immunized, they're good to go. They assume that when they got their Hep A and B, it was like somewhere included in there, even though it wasn't stated. So just be advised, it's not an immunization. Does anybody think that there is a treatment that will effectively cure Hep C?
No.
Oh, you're disappointing me, man. You did so good, especially with the Starburst jelly beans. No, there is actually treatment. There's a lot of treatments out there, and a lot of the treatments are really easy to take. A couple pills a day for a couple weeks, like 8 to 10 weeks. Insurance will pay for it at least once, as long as you're compliant and you don't fail it by non-compliance. So there is a cure out there, and it's really great. We're seeing really good success from it. So yeah, just kidding, Helen. Ha ha. You can go on, Thaddeus. So love your liver. Get vaccinated for the HEPs that you can. So the A and B have a vaccine. We have had patients, especially like patients who are a little older, even in their 40s and 50s though, who like they lost their immunity, like their vaccine kind of like wore off. That does happen. So there is testing that can determine whether or not you are still immune. I know it says no alcohol. Obviously, we're here drinking. I'm not going to say no alcohol, but if you do have any of these diagnoses, just be advised that like alcohol is not recommended, but also harm reduction model, live your life. Just be conscientious. You only have one liver and you can't live without your liver, guys. See what I did there? See what I did there? Okay. So just eat and be healthy. And then, yeah, so any questions? I don't have a title like Thaddeus, but I mean, you guys can feel free to ask.
You're a queen too, don't worry.
Okay, thanks.
Everyone, first, let's give a round of applause for Her Grace and His Majesty.
Thank you.
And then